The stars were cold and distant, but Earth's battles were warm with the fire of conflict. For years, humanity had fought to survive. The alien empires of the Zarin and Urari thought humanity was weak, fragile, just another species to be crushed beneath the boot of galactic conquest. They were wrong. Zarin commander Teleth sat at the helm of his ship, the Vengeance, a sleek and deadly warship. His eyes narrowed as he gazed upon the battle map. The human colonies had been scattered, their military forces broken. It was only a matter of time before the last remnants of Earth's defense would fall. He had watched them struggle, pitiful and futile, and now the final blow was about to be delivered. The last human ship was nearby, and his fleet would obliterate it with ease. "We should be done with this in less than an hour," Teleth said with a sneer, his voice calm but full of contempt. Around him, his officers nodded. The alien race was used to victory. For centuries, they had destroyed countless worlds, bending other species to their will. The humans were just a nuisance, a brief, flickering ember that would soon burn out. "Send in the Reapers," Teleth ordered. He waved his hand dismissively. "We'll wipe them out completely." In the vastness of space, the Zarin fleet moved with purpose, their ships as large as small moons, their weapons powerful enough to erase any planet from existence. The humans stood no chance. Far ahead of them, the human ship, the Vanguard, drifted in the silence of space. It was not the biggest ship. It wasn't the fastest. But it was enough. Its crew was enough. And that alone, that small detail, gave the humans something no alien force had ever understood: resolve. Captain Jack Stryker stood on the bridge of the Vanguard. His fingers drummed lightly on the metal console, the rhythmic sound a strange comfort in the midst of the chaos. The ship was battered, scarred from the long years of survival, but it was still here. He was still here. And so were the people who had fought, bled, and died to keep the human spirit alive. "We're outnumbered," said Lieutenant Helena West, her voice steady but tight with worry. "A full fleet. The Zarins brought everything." Stryker didn't flinch. "We've been outnumbered before." He had seen the human spirit, unbreakable, fierce, and relentless. Earth had been invaded. Entire cities had burned. But humanity had never surrendered. Every battle they fought, every loss they took, it only fueled them more. The fire that burned in their hearts could not be extinguished. But even with that unshakable resolve, this battle felt different. The odds weren't just stacked against them, they were crushing. If the Vanguard fell, humanity would fall. The message from the Zarin Empire was clear: we are going to finish what we started. Captain West's voice was firm. "What are the orders?" Stryker's eyes narrowed as he looked at the holographic map. The Zarin fleet was drawing closer. The ships were enormous, their hulls brimming with weapons designed to devastate anything in their path. They were going to launch the final assault, confident that nothing could stand in their way. He stood tall, his fingers still resting on the console, steadying himself. He had seen this moment before. He had seen it in the faces of those who had fought with him and those who had already fallen, and he would not let it happen again. "Activate the Dreadstrike missiles," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "We won't give them an easy victory." The crew moved quickly, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. The Dreadstrike missiles were humanity's trump card, nuclear-powered warheads designed to punch through any shield. They were humanity's last hope, and Captain Stryker was going to make sure they were used to their full potential. "Target the lead Zarin dreadnought," Stryker ordered, his eyes locking onto the enemy flagship on the screen. The Dreadstrike missiles locked into place, their energy humming with anticipation. The ship groaned as the engines powered up. For a brief, terrifying moment, the human crew could feel the weight of the task ahead. If they missed, if the missiles didn't connect, nothing would save them. "Fire!" The missiles shot forward, leaving the Vanguard in a blaze of light. They streaked across space, a comet of destruction aimed at the heart of the enemy. The Zarin ship fired back immediately, powerful beams of energy streaming from its cannons, but the Dreadstrike missiles were faster. They struck the enemy ship's shields, cracking them open, and then burrowed deep into the heart of the dreadnought, detonating with a force so immense it shook the surrounding stars. For a moment, everything was silent. The Zarin dreadnought was gone, reduced to glowing fragments that drifted through space. On the bridge of the Vanguard, the crew exhaled a collective breath of disbelief. "Direct hit," Lieutenant West whispered. "We did it." Stryker's jaw tightened. The enemy's flagship was gone, but the battle was far from over. The remaining Zarin ships would come, more powerful and more vicious than ever. The Vanguard was just one ship, and the Zarin fleet had enough firepower to wipe them out in seconds. But Captain Stryker didn't hesitate. He had learned long ago that hesitation in battle was a death sentence. "Don't let up," he said. "Bring the enemy to us." The crew moved with urgency, working together in a synchronized dance that was more than just a job. It was their survival. The Zaran fleet began to regroup, forming a wide formation to crush the human ship under a mountain of fire. But the Vanguard wasn't going down without a fight. "We'll make them regret ever underestimating us," Stryker said quietly, his eyes burning with determination. The Zarans had thought Earth was a broken, forgotten planet. They had thought the humans were weak. But in that moment, as the surviving ships of the human fleet circled the Vanguard, ready for the fight of their lives, Teleth realized one terrifying truth. The humans were far from finished. They were far from broken. They were alive. And as the battle began, Teleth could feel it. A deep, primal fear, because he knew this battle was not going to go as planned. The battle was chaos. The cold void of space had turned into a storm of flashing lights, deadly beams of energy, and the roar of metal tearing apart. The Zaran fleet was relentless, but so was the Vanguard. Despite being outnumbered, the human battleship fought like a living beast, tearing through the enemy lines with a fury that no one had expected. Captain Stryker stood at the center of the command deck, his eyes fixed on the holographic display as his hands moved with precision. His crew was everything. He knew they couldn't win this battle on their own, but together they were a machine, one that could fight with a power that no alien force had ever witnessed. "Target the closest destroyer," Stryker ordered, his voice calm but filled with the weight of responsibility. "Yes, Captain," Lieutenant West responded, her hands flying over the controls. The Vanguard's weapon systems hummed, and within seconds a torrent of fire ripped through space, hitting the enemy ship with unrelenting force. The Zaran destroyer attempted to dodge, but it was too slow. The impact of the human weapons cracked its shields and tore through its hull, sending the vessel spinning wildly into the vacuum of space. Another ship fell, one more enemy lost. But there were still hundreds more. The Vengeance, the flagship of the Zaran fleet, moved forward with a devastating purpose. Teleth stood at the helm of his ship, his eyes filled with hatred. He had watched the humans' unexpected strength and was beginning to feel something else: fear. "They've destroyed 2 of our ships," one of his officers reported, his voice trembling. "How is this possible? We outnumber them 5-1. Teleth's fist slammed onto the console. "We underestimated them," he growled. "Get us in range of their main weapon. I want that human ship destroyed." His officers scrambled, but it was too late. The Vanguard wasn't sitting still, waiting to be destroyed. It moved with deadly precision, its weapons shifting and adjusting faster than the Zarans could react. The Vanguard was alive with motion, its energy systems pulsing, its shields crackling as the Zaran firepower bounced off them, only to be absorbed and redirected into their own ships. "Captain, they're launching another round of Dreadstrike missiles." West's voice was sharp with urgency. "Brace for impact," Stryker shouted, gripping the edge of the console. The Vanguard's engines roared as it pivoted, evading the incoming onslaught of fire. But the missiles were relentless. One missile struck the lower hull, sending a violent tremor through the ship. For a moment the lights flickered and the crew felt the gut-wrenching sensation of weightlessness. But there was no time to panic. The damage was contained and the battle raged on. "Damage report," Stryker barked. "We've lost partial shielding on the starboard side, Captain," said Officer Parker, his voice steady despite the chaos. "But it's still holding. The weapon systems are operational." Stryker nodded. "Good, let's keep them in range. I want every shot to count." The crew worked with a synchronized precision that had been born from years of fighting impossible odds. They didn't need to think, they just acted. It was instinct. They had fought their hardest in the last few years, and they weren't about to stop now. As Stryker looked out over the command deck, he saw the faces of his crew, fierce, determined, and never willing to give up. They had all seen too much to turn back now. They were the last of humanity's fighting spirit, and they would hold the line until their last breath. "Fire again," Stryker ordered. The Vanguard unleashed another volley, and the energy from its guns painted the darkness of space with streaks of brilliant red. Zaran ships exploded one after another, their shields no match for the ferocity of the human weapons. But the Zarans were no fools. They adapted quickly, and soon they started to counter the human tactics, moving in closer to engage in a deadly close-range battle. "We're being surrounded," West called out, her voice rising in tension. "They're closing in on all sides. We can't hold them off much longer." Stryker's eyes burned with intensity. He couldn't let it end here, not after everything. Not after Earth had been ravaged and humanity had fought its way back from the edge of extinction. This ship, the Vanguard, wasn't just metal and wires. It was the embodiment of everything humanity had fought for: survival, strength, and the unyielding will to live. "Prepare the last of the Dreadstrike missiles," he ordered, his voice icy and commanding. "We're going to take down their flagship." "Yes, Captain," West replied, her fingers moving over the controls, setting the ship's weapons to full power. The Zarans had no idea what was coming. They had underestimated the humans time and time again, and now it was about to cost them everything. "Target locked," West said, her voice steady. "Ready to fire." Stryker nodded, his gaze never leaving the screen. The Vanguard lurched forward, a final, desperate push toward the heart of the enemy. The Zarans reacted quickly, focusing all their fire on the human ship. It was a gamble, a desperate, dangerous move, but there was no other choice. If they stayed at range, they would be destroyed. They had to get close. They had to make this count. Fire! The Dreadstrike missile launched, tearing through the chaos of the battlefield. It flew with precision, cutting through the enemy's defenses like a knife through butter. The Zaran flagship tried to raise its shields, but it was too slow, too weak. The missile slammed into the heart of the Vengeance, the explosion sending shockwaves through space. The flagship's shields flickered, then failed. The ship's core exploded in a burst of fire and light that consumed everything in its path. On the bridge of the Vanguard, a deep silence fell. The crew stared at the screen, watching as the remains of the Zaran flagship drifted in the void, a broken shell of what had once been a symbol of their power. We did it," West whispered, a mix of disbelief and awe in her voice. Stryker's jaw clenched. He wasn't celebrating. There was still more to do. The Zaran fleet was far from finished, and their forces were still vast. But for the first time, the Zarans had tasted what it meant to underestimate humanity. They had just lost their flagship, their pride. And that, Stryker knew, would shake them more than any weapon ever could. "Keep pushing forward," Stryker ordered. "We haven't won yet, we're not done." The battle was far from over, but the Vanguard had struck a blow no one would soon forget. And in the cold depths of space, the Zarans would learn a lesson that would echo through the stars. Never, ever underestimate humanity. The fight for survival wasn't over, but humanity wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The silence after the explosion of the Zaran flagship was deafening. For a brief moment, it felt as though the whole galaxy had paused, just long enough for everyone to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. The Vengeance was gone. The pride of the Zaran Empire had been obliterated by a single missile from the Vanguard. The shockwaves from the blast still rippled through space, a lingering reminder of the power the humans had unleashed. But the silence didn't last long. Captain Stryker's hand gripped the command console as the Vanguard rocked again. Another hit. The Zaran fleet wasn't retreating. They were regrouping, and now they were angrier than ever. "Captain," West shouted, "more ships coming in, they've got reinforcements." Stryker's jaw clenched as the display flickered to life, showing the vast number of ships still remaining in the Zaran fleet. It was overwhelming. There were dreadnoughts, battle cruisers, and destroyers, their massive hulls reflecting the distant light of the nearby star. They were closing in, forming a ring around the Vanguard. "We can't take much more of this," West said, her voice tight with the strain of holding back panic. "Their fleet is bigger than ever. We're outgunned." Stryker didn't let his gaze waver. He didn't have the luxury of panic. Not now. His crew needed him. The humans needed him. "We're not backing down," he said firmly, his voice calm despite the rising tension. "Not while we still have a fight left in us. Deploy all remaining Dreadstrikes." "We don't have enough," West said, her voice low. "We've used most of them already." "I know," Stryker replied, "but we're going to make these count." The Vanguard was taking hits from all sides now. The ship's shields were flickering, barely holding against the sheer volume of enemy fire. The energy from the Zaran cannons slammed into the hull, each shot a blow that rattled through the entire ship. Sparks flew from the ceiling, and the floor trembled underfoot as if the very ship itself were holding its breath. "Hull integrity at 70%, Captain," Officer Parker reported, his face pale but determined. "We can't take many more of these." Stryker's eyes flicked across the crew, meeting each of their gazes. He saw the fear in their eyes, but there was something else there too. A spark. They weren't going to give up, not now. "We hold," Stryker said. "We hold and we fight." He turned to Lieutenant West. "Get us in range of their closest cruiser. I want to hit them hard." West's fingers flew over the controls, and the Vanguard lurched forward, its engines roaring in defiance. The Zaran ships closed in tighter, their weapons unleashing a storm of energy. "Brace for impact," West called out, but it was too late. The next wave of fire hit with such force that it felt like the Vanguard might break apart. The crew was thrown from their seats, and alarms blared throughout the ship. Stryker gripped the console with both hands, fighting to stay steady as the floor tilted beneath him. Damage report, Stryker barked, trying to stay calm. Shields down to 40%, Parker responded, his voice strained. We've lost engine power in the aft section. Stryker's heart pounded. The Vanguard wasn't just being attacked, it was being torn apart. The Zarans had come to finish what they had started, and they weren't going to stop until the human ship was nothing more than space debris. But Stryker didn't flinch. He had come this far. The human race had come this far. Captain West said, her voice cracking with urgency, "We've got incoming. A full barrage from their remaining fleet." Stryker's mind raced, calculating. There was no way to outrun the incoming fire, no way to hide. If the Vanguard stayed in this position, it would be obliterated within minutes. But they couldn't just run, they had one shot left. "Get us to the heart of their formation," Stryker ordered. "We're going in." The crew's eyes widened. There was no way they could survive this, not against so many enemies, not with their shields failing and their weapons running low. But there was no hesitation. They followed Stryker's orders without question. They were humans, and they never stopped fighting. The Vanguard surged forward once more, its engines straining as it fought to push through the incoming fire. The Zaran ships concentrated their weapons on the human battleship, but still, the Vanguard pressed on. The explosions around them were deafening, but the ship didn't falter. Captain West said, her voice tight, "We're almost there. We're in range of their command ship." "Fire everything we have left," Stryker commanded. "All remaining missiles, all weapons." There was no room for second chances, no time for mistakes. The last Dreadstrike missiles shot forward with a roar, streaking through the blackness of space, guided by the human ship's weapon systems. The Zaran ships attempted to reposition, but it was too late. The missiles slammed into the heart of their command ship, the flagship that had survived so much. The explosion was so bright, so powerful, that it lit up the entire battlefield. The shockwaves sent debris scattering across the stars. For a moment, everything stopped. The Zaran fleet, stunned and disoriented, slowed their advance. The Vanguard drifted in the wreckage, smoke rising from its battered hull. The lights flickered, the systems sputtering as they struggled to remain operational. "We did it," West whispered, her eyes wide as she looked at the wreckage of the enemy flagship. But Stryker knew better. He wasn't celebrating yet. The Zarans hadn't been broken. They were regrouping, and they were angrier than ever. "Keep moving," Stryker ordered, his voice low but firm. "We hold the line, we keep fighting." West's hands moved over the controls once again, bringing the Vanguard back to life. The crew was exhausted, battered, but they weren't done. They would keep fighting until their last breath. Stryker looked out at the destruction around them. The stars were dimming. The Zaran fleet was still there, but so was humanity. "We haven't won yet," he said quietly, but with a fierce determination that burned through every word. "But we're still here, and we're not going anywhere." The Zarans would learn, the galaxy would learn. Humanity wasn't just a footnote in the story of the universe. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the battle, though far from over, had only just begun. The stars around the Vanguard flickered like distant witnesses to a battle no one could truly understand. Captain Stryker stood at the command deck, his hands steady on the console, but inside his mind raced. The Zaran fleet had been shattered, but they weren't defeated, not yet. There were still countless ships out there, and they were closing in. The enemy's formation was tighter now, like a noose slowly tightening around the human battleship. The remnants of the fleet had regrouped, and the surviving Zaran ships were preparing for one final push, a brutal assault that could finish the Vanguard once and for all. Every breath Stryker took felt like it could be his last. "Captain," Lieutenant West's voice crackled through the speakers, "they're moving in. The remaining dreadnoughts are locking weapons." Stryker's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the tactical screen. The enemy fleet had regrouped, and this time they weren't wasting any time. They were coming for the human ship with everything they had left. "We can't fight them all off," West added, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Our shields are almost down. Weapons are at 30% capacity." Stryker's eyes burned with a cold determination. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on his chest, but there was no room for fear. Not now. "We don't need to fight them all," he said quietly, the words hanging in the air like a declaration of war. "We need to make them feel us, hard." The crew didn't need any more words. They had been through hell together. They knew what needed to be done. "Helm, bring us to their command ship. Full speed ahead," Stryker ordered. The Vanguard groaned under the strain of its engines, but it surged forward, breaking through the enemy's outer defenses. Enemy fire rained down on them from all directions, bright streaks of light that turned the blackness of space into a battlefield. Each shot that landed made the ship tremble, but the Vanguard held steady. It was a fighter. It was human. "Brace for impact," West shouted as another round of fire hit them, sending the ship veering off course. Stryker gripped the rail beside him, his knuckles white. The Vanguard was a beast, but even the strongest beasts could fall. And the Zarans had learned how to break a beast's spirit. But as he looked around the bridge at his crew, at the people who had survived everything, they weren't afraid. They were determined. They weren't going down without making the enemy pay. "Fire everything we've got," Stryker barked. The ship shuddered as the Vanguard's cannons unleashed their full fury. The blasts of energy streaked out, cutting through the Zaran ships. The sound of exploding enemy vessels filled the bridge, a terrible, beautiful chorus of destruction. But there were too many Zaran ships still left. They were pushing forward, their weapons relentless. The Vanguard was becoming a target, and the enemy was closing in fast. "Shields at 15%, Captain," Parker, the operations officer, reported urgently. Stryker's heart raced. This was it. They were reaching the heart of the Zaran formation, the command ship, the last ship left standing that could control the remaining fleet. If they took it out, the rest of the Zaran forces would crumble. But to do that, they had to get close. Too close. The Vanguard swerved, narrowly dodging another blast, the ship's hull groaning under the pressure. Stryker could feel it in his bones. The ship was hurtling toward its breaking point, but there was no turning back now. "Captain," West shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "They're locking onto our core. They're going to target our reactor." Stryker's eyes widened. The reactor was the heart of the ship. If it was destroyed, everything was over. The entire ship would implode, taking everyone with it. "Deploy emergency countermeasures, now," he ordered. The crew moved quickly, their movements a well-practiced blur of survival. The ship's systems whined in protest, but the Vanguard wasn't done yet. The emergency countermeasures, disruptor fields, flared to life, sending out pulses of energy that scrambled the enemy targeting systems. It wasn't enough to stop the barrage, but it bought them precious seconds. "Keep pushing," Stryker said through gritted teeth. "We're not stopping." The Vanguard lurched forward once again, heading straight for the command ship in the heart of the Zaran fleet. The Zarans, in their desperation, continued to fire, their weapons making contact with the ship's weakened shields, causing sparks and crackling sounds to echo through the deck. "Shields at 5%, Captain," West said, her voice strained. "We don't need shields," Stryker responded, his voice ice cold. "We just need to hit them first." With a final, desperate push, the Vanguard slammed into the Zaran command ship's defense perimeter, the impact shaking the entire ship. Sparks erupted along the walls as the two ships collided, the sound of metal grinding against metal filling the air. "We're in," Stryker shouted, voice filled with raw determination. "Prepare to fire on their core." The last remaining Dreadstrike missiles were loaded, their warheads humming with power. The crew worked in a frenzied blur, inputting the targeting coordinates, guiding the ship's weapons systems to the very heart of the enemy's flagship. The tension on the bridge was unbearable. The Vanguard had taken every last hit. It was hanging on by a thread, one final push. The Dreadstrikes were launched. The explosion was massive. A violent shockwave ripped through the blackness of space, lighting up the battlefield like a supernova. The Zaran command ship's shields buckled under the force of the missiles. For a moment, it seemed as if everything had stopped. No fire, no explosions. Just the briefest, silent breath before everything was consumed in a blinding burst of light. And then nothing. The Vanguard hung in the silence, the remnants of the Zaran command ship drifting in pieces around it. The ship's lights flickered, and the crew was stunned into silence. We did it," West whispered. But Stryker didn't celebrate. The enemy fleet wasn't gone. There were still dozens of ships, and the Vanguard was on the edge of collapse. They had delivered the fatal blow to the Zaran leadership, but now the remaining fleet would come for them with a vengeance. "Keep firing," Stryker said, his voice unwavering. "We're not done yet." The crew didn't hesitate. They never did. With the last of their strength, they fired the remaining weapons, hitting ship after ship, dismantling the Zaran fleet bit by bit. But the battle wasn't over yet. There were still too many enemies, and the Vanguard systems were failing. Stryker stood tall even as the ship groaned beneath him. There was no choice now. They had to keep going. They had to finish it no matter what the cost. And as the Vanguard fought on, one thing became clear. The Zarans had no idea what they were up against. Humanity had proven one thing tonight: never ever underestimate them. The darkness of space was shattered by the blinding glow of dying ships. The Zaran command ship had been destroyed, its pieces floating through the void like the remains of a fallen giant. The Vanguard was still alive, barely, but the battle was far from over. The enemy fleet, though reeling from the loss of their leadership, wasn't retreating. If anything, they were pushing harder, faster. Their thirst for vengeance was palpable. Captain Stryker stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The Vanguard was battered, its hull scarred from countless impacts. Its engines sputtered, barely keeping the ship moving. The crew was exhausted, their faces drawn with fatigue, but there was something else in their eyes, something unbreakable. The fight was not over, not as long as they still had breath in their lungs. "Status report," Stryker barked, his voice calm but hard. "Shields are at 10%, Captain," Lieutenant West replied, her voice tight. "We've got minimal power left in the engines. The Dreadstrike missiles are all used up. We're running on reserves." Stryker's jaw clenched. They had fought against impossible odds, and yet here they were, standing on the edge of defeat. The Zaran fleet had regrouped, and the enemy ships were closing in on all sides. The humans had taken down the enemy's command ship, but it had cost them everything. Every shot from the enemy now seemed like it could be the one that would finish the Vanguard off. "We can't keep this up much longer," West said, her voice laced with fear. "They're surrounding us. They're coming for the kill." Stryker turned to face his crew. They were all looking at him, eyes filled with uncertainty, but still burning with the fierce determination that had driven them this far. "We don't have to outrun them," Stryker said, his voice steady. "We just have to make them pay." West's eyes widened. "How?" Stryker turned back to the screen. The Zaran fleet was closing in. There was no escape. The Vanguard couldn't outrun the enemy. Its engines were too damaged, and its shields were almost gone. But there was one thing the Zarans didn't know. The Vanguard had one final trick. "We're going to do what we do best," Stryker said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "We're going to hit them where it hurts." The crew worked in a blur, knowing that this was their last chance. There was no time to think. They had to act, and they had to act now. "Bring the engines online," Stryker ordered, his eyes scanning the chaotic battlefield. "Engage the gravity well." The gravity well? It was an old tactic, something humanity had used in the early years of their war for survival. The gravity well could manipulate the gravitational pull of the ship, using the ship's massive mass to pull enemy ships closer. It would make the Vanguard the center of the storm, but it would also draw the enemy ships into a deadly trap. The ship groaned as the engines roared to life, the gravity well systems kicking in. The battlefield shifted in response as the pull began to take hold, dragging the closest Zaran ships toward them. "Captain, the gravity well is pulling them in," West reported, her hands flying over the controls. "But their ships are compensating. They're fighting the pull." Stryker's eyes were fixed on the screen. The enemy was adjusting their course, trying to stay out of the pull. But it was already too late. The Vanguard wasn't just pulling them toward it, it was pulling them into a trap. "Get us closer," Stryker ordered. "We need to hit them before they break free." The Vanguard lurched forward, the damaged engines screaming in protest. The gravity well had made their movements slower, more vulnerable, but they couldn't stop now. The enemy ships caught in the pull were slowly being dragged toward the human ship's firing range. They were too close for comfort, but that's exactly what Stryker needed. The closer they were, the harder it would be for the Zarans to escape. "Fire everything we've got," Stryker ordered, his voice steady. "No hesitation now." The remaining weapons on the Vanguard roared to life. A barrage of laser fire and plasma missiles erupted from the ship, the blasts tearing into the closest Zaran ships. The enemy had no time to dodge. The force of the gravity well had them locked in place, unable to evade the oncoming attack. Explosions erupted across the battlefield. Zaran ships began to fall, one after another, their shields failing under the relentless onslaught. The Vanguard's firepower was brutal and precise, carving through the enemy fleet like a hot knife through butter. But there were still too many ships left. The Zarans were relentless, and their desire for vengeance burned hot. The Vanguard's shields were failing fast, and the ship was slowly being pulled apart by the constant barrage of enemy fire. "Shields are at 2%, Captain," Parker, the operations officer, said, his voice grim. "We won't survive another direct hit." "We don't need to," Stryker said, his eyes never leaving the screen. "We just need to keep them off balance long enough." The gravity well was taking its toll on the Vanguard as well. The engines were strained to their limit, and the ship groaned under the pressure. The systems were starting to fail, one by one. But still, the crew fought on. A massive Zaran dreadnought loomed ahead, its weapons charging. It fired, the blast of energy streaking toward the Vanguard. Stryker's eyes widened as the shot closed in. There was no way the Vanguard could dodge it, no way to deflect the impact. But then something unexpected happened. A smaller ship, one of the remaining human fighters, dove into the path of the blast, taking the hit in place of the Vanguard. The explosion was deafening, and for a moment it seemed like everything had stopped. Stryker's heart clenched as he watched the small fighter ship disintegrate in a brilliant flash of light. The pilot had given everything to save them. "Damn it," Stryker whispered under his breath. The Vanguard had been hit hard, but it wasn't destroyed. The human pilot's sacrifice had bought them precious seconds. The Zaran dreadnought, distracted by the unexpected turn of events, faltered. "Now," Stryker shouted, "fire everything." The last of the Vanguard's weapons roared to life. A final desperate barrage of plasma missiles and cannon fire ripped through the air, tearing into the dreadnought. The ship's shields buckled, then shattered. The core exploded in a bright, fiery burst, sending shockwaves through the surrounding enemy ships. The Zaran fleet reeled from the blow. The remaining ships faltered, their morale shattered by the destruction of their flagship. The gravity well still pulling them in had caught them in a trap. They couldn't escape. Stryker's breath came in short gasps. The battle wasn't over. But in this moment the tide had turned. The Zarans had underestimated humanity, and now they were learning the cost of that mistake. "We've still got a fight ahead," Stryker said, his voice steady despite the weight of the battle. "But we've made our mark, we're not done yet." The crew nodded, their faces grim but resolute. Humanity had just turned the tide, and they were not about to stop fighting. The battle was far from over, but the Zaran fleet was in disarray. The explosions that had ripped through their ranks had shattered their confidence. The loss of their flagship, their pride, had dealt a blow no one expected. The remaining Zaran ships, though still formidable, were now unsure. Their focus had shifted from victory to survival. And that, Stryker knew, was humanity's opening. The Vanguard was barely holding together. Its hull was peppered with scorch marks, and the glowing red warning lights flickered on the bridge. The ship's systems were near failure, its engines sputtering and its shields almost gone. The crew was exhausted, their faces pale from the constant strain of fighting with everything they had left. But they weren't giving up. Not now. "Captain," Lieutenant West said, her voice tight, "we've taken out their dreadnoughts. The remaining fleet is scattered, but we're still vulnerable. Our position's compromised. If they regroup, we won't survive another push." Stryker stood in front of the command console, his gaze fixed on the tactical map. The remaining Zaran ships were regrouping, trying to reorganize their formation, but they were desperate, and desperate enemies made mistakes. That was something Stryker had learned after years of fighting. They were stronger than they thought, stronger than anyone had expected. And now they were making the same mistake again, underestimating humanity. "They won't regroup in time," Stryker said quietly. "We're going to end this now." West glanced at him, her eyes wide. "How? There's still too many, Captain, and we fight until the last breath," Stryker interrupted. He turned to his crew, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We hold the line no matter what. We make them pay for every inch of space they've taken from us." The crew nodded. Their exhaustion was clear, but so was their resolve. They had come this far, they had lost so much already. There was no turning back. Stryker's mind raced. The Zarans had underestimated Earth's people, thought of them as weak, primitive. But they were wrong. Humans had survived the impossible. They had fought, rebuilt, and come back stronger. And now, with the Zaran fleet weakened, they were going to finish it. But they had to move quickly. The Zarans were strong, and if they could regroup, they would strike back harder than before. The humans needed to act before the enemy had a chance to recover. "Parker, send the last of our coordinates to the remaining fighter squadron. We're going to need them," Stryker said. Officer Parker didn't hesitate. "Aye, Captain." Stryker's hands tightened into fists as he looked out at the stars. This was their last chance. The Vanguard was more than a ship. It was a symbol of humanity's resilience, and he would be damned if it fell now. On the battlefield, the Zaran fleet was reeling. Their forces were scattered, each ship trying to find its footing after the devastating loss of the flagship. The dreadnoughts that remained were focused on the Vanguard, but the tide of the battle had already begun to shift. The human ship had taken their best shots and kept fighting. The Zarans had underestimated the resolve of those they had once thought of as nothing more than weak primitives. "I want that human ship destroyed," Teleth growled from the bridge of his command vessel, his face a mask of fury. "They've taken out 2 of our dreadnoughts, and now they think they can win." His officers stood at attention, but there was fear in their eyes. The humans had done something the Zarans never expected. They had hurt them. They had hurt them badly. "Their ship is still heavily damaged, Commander," one of the officers said, his voice shaky. "Our forces are regrouping, but we're not ready to launch a full counterattack yet. If we push forward now, we risk everything." Teleth's eyes burned with rage. "No, we strike now, we finish them before they can recover." Back aboard the Vanguard, Stryker's crew was moving quickly. The fighter squadron had received their orders and were preparing for a final assault. The last of the Dreadstrike missiles had been loaded, and the gravity well was still pulling in the remnants of the Zaran fleet. They were too close now to escape. Captain West called, her voice full of urgency. "They're moving in. We've got dreadnoughts closing fast. They're coming right at us." Stryker's heart pounded. He didn't need to look at the display to know what was coming. The Zarans were about to throw everything they had left at them. It was their last chance to finish the battle. "Hold steady," Stryker ordered. "We don't back down, not now." West nodded, her face grim but resolute. She knew the stakes as well as he did. If the Zarans broke through, if they managed to land one more crushing blow, the vanguard would be gone. But Stryker wasn't about to let that happen. "Captain," Parker said, his voice shaky but determined, "we've got one shot. If we don't take them out now, we won't make it." Stryker's eyes burned. There was no time left. The Zarans were closing in too quickly. West set course for their lead dreadnought. "Full speed ahead," Stryker commanded, his voice fierce. "Parker, fire the last of the Dreadstrikes. We end this now." The bridge fell silent as the crew worked together, each of them knowing that this could be their last action. The vanguard surged forward, its engines pushing the battered ship toward the heart of the enemy formation. The Zaran ships fired everything they had, but the vanguard pressed on, its shields flickering as they absorbed the impact. "Get us in close," Stryker shouted. "We're not stopping, not until that dreadnought is gone." The crew worked with a precision born of desperation. They had nothing left to lose. The vanguard shuddered as the last Dreadstrike missile launched, a streak of light cutting through the chaos of battle. The missile rocketed toward the lead Zaran dreadnought, striking it with devastating force. The explosion was massive, lighting up the battlefield. The remaining Zaran ships faltered as their flagship fell. And then silence. The remaining Zaran ships paused, the threat of their command ship's destruction hanging over them. For the first time, they were unsure. Fear spread through the fleet like wildfire. Teleth, watching from his command deck, clenched his fists. The realization hit him hard. The humans had done it. They had destroyed their last hope. The vanguard wasn't just fighting to survive. It had broken the Zaran fleet. Stryker stood on the bridge, his chest heavy but his eyes hard. The Zarans had underestimated humanity. They had thought the fight was over. They had thought the humans would fall without a fight. Now they knew better. Stryker turned to his crew. "We've won the first battle," he said quietly, his voice filled with quiet pride. "But this isn't over yet." The crew nodded, their faces filled with the same determination. They had broken the Zaran fleet, and humanity had shown the galaxy that it was stronger than any enemy could ever imagine. The galaxy was still, suspended in the aftermath of the battle. The once mighty Zaran fleet lay broken and scattered, debris floating through the cold expanse of space. The vanguard was still standing, barely, but it had done the impossible. It had torn through the enemy's ranks, and in the process, it had shown the galaxy the strength of humanity. But even as the last of the Zaran ships fled, even as the remnants of their fleet drifted into the distance, Captain Stryker knew this wasn't over. No, the battle had been won, but the war was only just beginning. The Vanguard's bridge was silent except for the quiet hum of its failing systems. Sparks flickered in the corners of the room, and the crew moved like ghosts, their faces pale from exhaustion. Every single person aboard the ship had given everything, every ounce of their strength, every last breath they could muster. Stryker stood at the command console, his fingers brushing the map of the battlefield, still alive with the scattered remnants of the once threatening Zaran fleet. His eyes were hard, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet understanding of what this moment meant. Humanity had fought and bled to get to this point, but the victory was only a spark. The galaxy would take notice of what had just happened. There was no going back now. "Captain," Lieutenant West's voice cut through the stillness, her voice raw from the battle. "We've got survivors. The Zarans, some of their fleet is retreating. They're heading to deep space, but they won't stop." Stryker's jaw tightened. He had expected this. The Zarans were a proud people. They would never accept a defeat so humiliating. They would regroup. They would retaliate. "They'll come back," Stryker said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet fire. "And when they do, we'll be waiting." West looked at him, her eyes filled with something Stryker could recognize all too well. The weariness of someone who had fought too many battles, but the determination to fight one more. She nodded, the weight of their responsibility hanging heavy in the air. "We've bought ourselves time," she said, "but we're not done, not by a long shot." Stryker turned, his eyes meeting the faces of the crew. Parker, the operations officer, was still working furiously at his console, trying to keep the Vanguard running despite the damage. The rest of the crew were tending to their own stations, doing what they could to keep the ship functional. There was no time to rest. There was no time to breathe. "How long until we can get back to Earth?" Stryker asked, his voice low. "Several hours at least," Parker responded. "The engines are barely holding together. We've got just enough power to make it back, but after that, I don't know how long we'll last." Stryker nodded grimly. He knew the Vanguard couldn't take much more. Every system was failing. But it didn't matter. They had done what they set out to do. They had struck fear into the heart of the Zarans. "All right," Stryker said, his voice steady. "We'll make it back. We'll get the repairs we need, and we'll prepare for what comes next. This fight is far from over, but we'll be ready." The journey back to Earth was a long one. The Vanguard limped through the stars, its damaged hull gliding through the blackness like a wounded animal. The crew moved like shadows, too tired to speak, too worn to think about anything other than the task at hand. Stryker stood on the bridge, staring out at the endless expanse of space. The battle had been a victory, yes, but at what cost? They had taken down one fleet, but there would be more. And next time the Zarans would be even more determined, more prepared. The question wasn't whether they would fight again, it was when. "Captain," West said quietly from behind him, "we've got incoming messages, a lot of them." Stryker turned, raising an eyebrow. "From who?" "From every major military command, from the Council. The entire galaxy is asking questions." He felt a chill run down his spine. The galaxy had been watching. The Zarans hadn't just been one empire in a corner of space. They were a force, an empire that had been a major player in the galaxy for centuries. And now humanity had just wiped out a chunk of their fleet. The implications were huge. Stryker nodded, "Put it through." A holographic display appeared before him, and the voices of the galaxy's leaders filled the room. The Council of Galactic Command, the most powerful representatives from every major race, appeared one by one, their faces a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and something else. Fear. "Captain Stryker," the first voice said, a grizzled Zaran general, "I will be blunt. What you did today, we did not think you capable, but you've proven us wrong." Stryker stood tall, his voice unwavering. "We didn't just prove you wrong, we proved that humanity isn't something you can just crush underfoot. We're here to stay." Another figure, a towering Urari commander, stepped forward, his massive form looming over the holographic display. "You've destroyed a part of our greatest threat. The Zaran Empire will never forget this. But I must ask, what will humanity do next? What is your goal in this war?" Stryker paused for a moment, considering the question. There was no easy answer. Humanity had been pushed to the brink of extinction. They had fought for survival, and now they had a choice, to remain hidden, weak, or to stand and fight as equals. "We'll do what we've always done," Stryker said, his voice quiet but strong. "We will survive, and we will not go back to the shadows." A murmur passed through the council. The Zaran general's face twisted into a scowl. "You think you can stand against us, after everything we've done to you?" "We've done more than survive," Stryker replied, his gaze hardening. "We've fought, and we've won. And if you or any other empire wants to challenge that, then we'll fight again. But this time it won't be for survival, it'll be for control." Silence fell across the room. The Urari commander nodded, his deep voice calm but heavy with respect. "You have our attention, Captain. Humanity has proven its strength. You are no longer just another species to be conquered. You are a force in this galaxy." Another voice, this one softer, a human voice, broke the tension. It was Admiral Jameson, who had been a key figure in humanity's rebuilding. "We're ready for whatever comes next, Captain. The galaxy will know we fight for each other. We fight for Earth." Stryker looked around at his crew, the people who had made it possible. They had not just survived, they had sent a message. And the message was clear: humanity was no longer weak. Humanity was a power in the galaxy. They had won their first battle, but this was just the beginning. The Zarans had learned their lesson, and the rest of the galaxy would soon learn it too. The Vanguard may have been battered, but its spirit was unbroken. And so was humanity's. They were no longer hiding. The fight for their future had just begun. And no one would ever forget the name of humanity again.